I think I finally understand why people didn't really get into Alex Garland's new movie Civil War. It's because you're not photographers, so you simply cannot get it.
Oh, that's real nice.
No! God, please, no! No!
Welcome back to Torn Apart, and today we're talking about Alex Garland's new movie called Civil War. Of course, what I was saying at the beginning of this video is not 100% true, but since I'm a photographer myself, I was like, I have some interesting things to add about this movie that maybe a lot of people didn't see just because you don't have that specific look at real life, or you don't really have many friends who work within those industries. So I was like, I want to tell you what I think about it.
Go, 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 go!
God bless America.
First of all, when I came out of the theater, I actually, well, loved the film. I think I gave it like a perfect score, and I'm pretty sure it's gonna go down in the next few months and weeks. That's usually what happens because I start noticing and remembering quite a lot of problems with the film itself. Even if you compare it to other Alex Garland's movies, I'm pretty sure it's not actually as good as his previous work. I really fell in love with Annihilation, and I really love, of course, Ex Machina, and I completely despised his movie Men. I actually have a video about this as well, which is a full deconstruction on why I think that thematically speaking that film doesn't work at all. But actually, if we go back on his filmography, it might reveal some stuff about Civil War that we didn't notice before. First of all, let's start by the plot. What is this movie about? Civil War is a journey across a dystopian future America, following a team of military embedded journalists as they race against time to reach DC before rebel factions descend upon the White House, depose the President of the United States, and probably kill him without actually giving him any time to explain himself. This is really the most simplistic way of explaining the plot, but when it comes to the marketing and how this film has been sold to the public, this seems to be a very political film because, well, we have an America that is divided in a lot of different factions, and a lot of people have been discussing about one specific faction that doesn't make a lot of sense, which is the Western Front faction, which is made out of the state of California, which you can see here on my shirt, and Texas.
That is without a doubt the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Which are two states that have nothing to do with each other, and they don't have a lot of things in common at the end of the day. So a lot of the discourse online has been about that, and a lot of the disappointment that people have found with this movie has been political, mostly because it doesn't really explain a lot. It doesn't really tell us why we are into this civil war. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really make us engage with one front or the other one. We're kind of impartial and objective spectators of this war, kind of in the same way that the journalists are, which is an interesting point to be when you think about it. First of all, when you look at post-apocalyptic and dystopian movies, I feel like we don't really question politics that much, and we don't really ask about the origins of certain wars or invasions. I really think it's kind of unfair that people are being so negative about Civil War, mostly because of this lack of political complexity within the movie. I think the movie is just not about that. It's not really a political movie, it's something much different. I actually seen other reviewers talking about this film, and there is this French reviewer who was specifically talking about the fact that why would you place a civil war in the context of the United States in the near future, because there is absolutely nothing that signals to us that it's been 100 if not 200 years into the future. There are no smartphones that we've never seen, there are no weapons that we've never seen. Everything seems to be completely normal. So his question was, why would you actually decide to place this movie within that context and not claim that you're making some kind of political stand? And this movie doesn't actually have a political stand because of that. It stays perfectly in the middle. We don't really know exactly which faction is supposed to be representing the Democrats, which faction is supposed to be representing the Republicans, but there is one thing that we can be sure of, and is that the President of the United States within this movie is definitely supposed to be Trump. He's going into his third election elections, and it seems like he's done something so incredibly disgusting for the American public that he's literally destroyed it to the point that, well, everyone is for themselves and we don't really know exactly who to trust and we don't really know exactly who to follow because nobody just explains why they're fighting.
We're gonna die! It's every man for himself! Help me, Leela!
And I know that this can be a little bit unnerving for people, mostly because, well, we're going towards a new election in the US, and here in Europe as well, we're going through the European elections at the same time, meaning that as a people, we are in a state where we actually want to talk about things that are going on in our countries, how to fix them, and things that are going terribly wrong and that seem to be getting worse and worse and worse. So to be delivered with a movie like this, that through the marketing campaign has been portrayed as so incredibly political, and it's almost like it has the key to solving the problems that we have in our contemporary state, it actually ends up being quite hollow, so people end up being disappointed. My main argument on why I think this movie actually works has to do with point of view. This movie takes the point of view of a photographer played by Kirsten Dunst and of all the other journalists within the movie, but mostly the photographers themselves, because you can really see that the actor who is playing the journalist who is supposed to be the interviewer, or the other one who ends up writing articles for the New York Times, they don't really know what to do with themselves, so very often during action sequences they either end up hanging back or they end up aiding and helping the photographers while they're trying to take as many snapshots as possible. Having said that, I think that once you see this film through this lens, everything changes completely, because it explains quite a lot when it comes to the cinematography, it explains quite a lot when it comes to why the action sequences are shot this way, why certain characters behave in a specific way, and it also clarifies the fact that Alex Garland didn't want to make a political movie, not at all. He wanted to make a dystopian science fiction movie and giving the key to this movie to a photographer. If we go back to his filmography, as I was mentioning before, look at his previous films. We've got Ex Machina, which is a movie that is definitely shot through the lens and the perspective of artificial intelligence. The movie definitely asks us to identify and empathize with the artificial intelligence instead of everyone else. Then we have Annihilation, which Alex Garland has clarified in quite a lot of interviews that this movie is actually about a battle versus cancer. So you can see every single scene through that lens, and you can see the disease trying to change basically nature on Earth, trying to change human beings from their perspective for the better, but from the perspective of us, the human beings, it looks disgusting, it looks like monsters, and at the end of the day, it destroys us and the planet at the same time. And then we've got Men, which is most recent film, and here it takes the point of view of women trying to understand their trauma, trying to understand how they behave, especially when it comes to relating with abusive men. And here we go back to Civil War. Just have a look, for example, at the scene with the snipers when everyone is lying down on the floor and we're patiently waiting for these American soldiers to find the opponent sniper to kill them so that it might free our main characters to keep going on their journeys. We have Lee, who is basically looking at flowers, and we see everything that it goes blurry, and she focuses just on the flowers, which are literally in between her and the soldiers who are on top of each other. And then opposite of her point of view, we have the other journalist who desperately wants to know who this opponent is, to what faction do they actually belong, and why do they deserve to die, why are they shooting. And the soldiers, of course, don't give a fuck about answering those questions, because as they say, he shot at us and now we don't have a choice. If we want to be free, we have to shoot him back.
Yo, what's over there in that house?
Someone shooting?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the thing is, when I'm talking about taking the point of view of a photographer, I'm talking about really being in the head of a photographer, trying to understand how he or she perceives the world. And this is exactly how you perceive the world. There are certain moments, for example, when you're walking around in a street as a photographer, or even in really traumatizing or fast-paced events, where you focus on the most weirdest things possible just because they look good and just because you wish you could take your camera out and photograph photograph them. And I feel like this is exactly what is happening within this scene here with the snipers. She suddenly just realizes that those flowers with that specific bouquet, with the snipers and the backgrounds and the context of everything that is happening around those flowers, they look beautiful. They have an interesting part to play in this big story. I found that completely fascinating. There are so many moments where the plot just stops for them to take out their cameras and be like, shoot that helicopter, shoot that scene. And we've got a mentorship going on in between the older photographer who is played by Kirsten Dunst and the new photographer who wants to be a war photographer who is played by Cailee Spaeny. I think there is a lot going on in this movie, specifically when we look just at these two characters and the way that basically the older photographer Lee is trying to show her how she perceives the world, how she perceives this war as a photographer, not necessarily as an American or as a human being who is trying to survive like everyone else. So if you see the movie from this perspective, immediately you're like, well, as a photographer, you wouldn't necessarily care about knowing exactly the context about everything. Of course, there are some faults within this argument because she's not just a photographer, she's a war photographer, she's a journalist as well, meaning that she would be seeking truth as much as possible and to know everything about everyone. But I think also that just because she seems to be a very renowned photographer who is probably at the end of her career, she's kind of detached herself from reality to the point that she just thinks about the perfect shots. She doesn't really think about the context around it anymore. She's just there to take pictures, to take the most important and the most beautiful and well-framed pictures. Going to Washington and meeting the president almost seems like a checklist that she wants to tick off her list before she retires or before she moves on to something different. There is even a moment, for example, when she's talking about the work as a photographer when you're going to different countries, you're going on expeditions and you see these wars, you see these conflicts, and you send those pictures back to United States and you wish for people to perceive them, understand them as, do you see what is happening here? Do you see all the death, all the despair, all the violence? Try not to reproduce it back at home. But nobody seems to care because everyone sees pictures as just pictures. And nowadays I think it's a discussion that was worth having for a bit more time. I think pictures are kind of disposable. Like as a photographer, I have that sense that you could be spending like a year and a half on a project, sometimes even more. You put it out there, you get a lot of praise, maybe you get a lot of awards, you get a lot of media attention, and it could last maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a maximum a couple of months, but that's it. Already people, while you're promoting your work, they're asking you what are you gonna do next, because the hype for what you've already done is almost perishing and it's already disappearing. And I feel like that's something that people don't really understand about photography as much, and that's why they didn't really see that perspective within the film itself. It's really fascinating because when I started having this specific reading of the film itself, everything started like making sense to me. For example, there is a moment when Lee and Cailee Spaeny's character are talking about their favorite photographers, and she literally just mentions one of them and she says that the other one is Lee. And it's really funny because I've seen critics out there pointing out the fact that we don't go deep into the photographer's ways of working as well. But I think that it's not because they wanted to be superficial, it's because photographers talk that way as well. In my life, I've had so many conversations with people, and specifically other photographers and artists, where you're just kind of naming artists that you like for one reason or another, but very often you end up going back to your work, the way that it inspires you and the way that it motivates you to create pictures that are different from that. So you basically define yourself in opposition, in contrast with big names, and you don't really end up talking about photographers for that long, because photography is one of those art forms that is very point of view focused, as in it's about your vision, and it's actually more true when it comes to photo reportage and photo documentary as well, where you're the one who is actually telling the story, you're the one who's putting all of the puzzle pieces together. You've got subjects in front of you who are allowing you to tell that story, but without you, that story does not exist.
I'm stronger. I'm smarter. I'm better. I am better.
And this kind of job exists completely in opposition with the filmmaking industry when you think about it, because filmmaking is 100% collaborative. You cannot really say that a movie has been made just by one person, especially when you have a list of like 100, if not 1,000 people who have worked on it. It's almost impossible to say things like that, but you can say it with photography. So you end up dealing with people that have a big ego and that very often perceive themselves as more important than the actual issues that they're covering. And I feel like this is what this movie is actually about. And that's why Alex Garland doesn't really go in details when it comes to all the political aspects of this film, because the photographers within it don't really care about it. There are so many moments and action sequences when it's really clear that the photographers are in the way of the soldiers doing their work, and they're not just putting themselves in danger, they're putting everyone else's in danger. Because if you pay attention, if you look back at all the action sequences, you will have so many moments where the soldiers are shoving the photographers to the side, trying to get them basically protected. But while they're doing that, they're actually losing focus on what they're trying to do themselves, so they're putting themselves and their colleagues in danger. Just to say that it's really funny how this movie takes the perspective of photographers so much to the point that the story completely shifts so that it works only in the photographer's favors. Do you remember that scene, for example, while they're driving at night through a forest that is going through a fire, and you have all these embers flying around and it looks really beautiful, it's really aesthetically pleasing, right? I've seen people complaining about the purpose of that scene, completely useless, we don't know where that fire comes from, it's just there to look pretty. But that is the point. If this film is told through the perspective of a photographer, of course it's there just to be pretty. And of course they would take the risk of driving through a forest at night while there is a fire involved, just because it looks pretty and you might be able to take pictures. And even if you don't take pictures, that image is still gonna be in your mind. Normal people would never do that when you think about it. If you see a fire in a forest, would you actually drive through it? Pretty sure that normal people would stop the car and be like, there is a forest fire out there, what should we do about it? But no, they decided to just drive through and look at it. And I find it fascinating that the third act of this movie kind of looks like a Call of Duty mission. Have you noticed that? I feel like everything is going so smoothly. All of the puzzle pieces are coming together. We got the Western Front soldiers coming from one side to the next, proceeding from one room to the next when they finally get into the White House. But also before the White House, when you've got the cars coming out and you've got a perfectly timed out car which hits it to the side. I mean, you could actually argue that this was mostly because screenwriters write action movies that way so that everything feels perfectly coordinated. So war doesn't really look like war in this film. And you could also argue that since the Western Front just takes two countries, why are they so well organized? Because when you think about it, if there is a civil war, you would think about guerrilla fighting, guerrilla warfare, which is something that we actually get a glimpse at in a previous action scene where they're fighting on two different levels. Some soldiers are up here and the other ones are down below, and there is this other soldier who is actually hiding behind a pillar and they're trying to make him escape. That's the kind of fighting that you would imagine in a civil war, definitely not what you would imagine in the third act of this movie. And I think the third act happens this way because once again we're seeing this scene through the perspective of photographers, and of course photographers would perceive that scene that way because everything needs to be exciting, everything needs to be well paced so that they can take the perfect shot. I actually don't know that many war photographers. I know a lot of photojournalists and I asked them about it and they said that, well, you could actually do that kind of following soldiers with your camera for a while, but you would never be able to do it for so long, for such a long action sequences as you can see in the third act. It's kind of like fulfilling the perfect fantasy of a war photographer who is literally able to be behind the soldiers as they're going through their mission step by step, which is something that I'm pretty sure you would never be able to do because first of all secrecy, and second of all I'm pretty sure that the soldiers would be pissed off at some point to have someone that they have to drag around while they have to risk their lives. The thing that I found fascinating is also that there is no way that you would actually allow photographers to do this. It would actually be so much more interesting to have videographers do what the photographers are doing because you don't have to actually frame anything, you just have to take your camera like this and follow everyone, and then you will be able to get the same amount of footage. And I feel like this is once again a proof that this entire film, this entire script is created to give power and exposure to the photographers who are trying to tell this story. Of course, you can even look at everything that is going on in the White House. Once again, they're literally like going from one room to the next, pointing their camera and shooting as if they were actually shooting with their weapons. I feel like Alex Garland in this final act is kind of like making this look very stupid, because we get the point of why Cailee Spaeny's photo is actually very important when she takes the picture of the guy trying to save the other soldier who is lying on the floor. It looks beautiful and it says something about the conflict, and it's about human emotion as well. But then what about the images that you'll be taking in the White House? What does that say about anything? Don't you think that she would have been able to take exactly those images if they let the soldiers come in, kill everyone, and then come inside and then take them or restage some of them? I'm pretty sure the result would have been exactly the same. It's just that it fulfills the fantasy that the photographers desperately wanted to have, because this entire journey was about them going to the White House and meeting the president. So that's why it's shot that way, because we want to be in their head, we want to have exactly the same experience as they are having, and that's why I think this movie works so well. But I also think that the minor flaws that the script has when it comes to explaining the conflict don't work in the film's favor at the end of the day. For example, I was looking at the map that I could find on Wikipedia, which was basically showing how the United States have been divided because of this civil war. And when I watched the movie, I was 100% convinced there were only two sides. The US government, basically, which is following the president's orders, and the Western Front with Texas and California. But there are actually four factions, and the two other ones we almost never talk about them. And I'm talking about the Florida Alliance and the New People's Army. What is the point of having those two if you don't really explain what is the difference in between all of them? You know what I mean? I feel like this is poor storytelling, it's poor world building. I feel like you could have made this movie without actually telling us that this was a political movie, but at the end of the day this would have ended up being an A24 art house, kind of like a war photography film, which is not what Alex Garland wanted to do. I feel like he was trying to do a bit of a hybrid thing, a bit of both, but he definitely didn't succeed at making us understand what the scope is when it comes to this war. I also think it's not a coincidence that one of the most talked about moments in this movie, it's the sequence taking place basically in the countryside with Jesse Plemons, who has kidnapped two of our main characters and he's basically getting ready to execute them. We've got some horrific scenes that basically remind us of things that have happened, well, in World War II. We've got literally a truck full of corpses who seem to be civilians because they're not wearing the same clothes, and it's very obvious that here we've got something political, here we've got an important message that is being delivered, and that's probably why this stick into people's minds, because this is the type of movie that they thought they were getting themselves into. So we have this moment where Jesse Plemons is asking them and basically interrogating them about what kind of Americans they are, and it turns out to be that he's a racist. He's taking advantage of the situation dressed up as a soldier without actually knowing if he is a soldier at the end of the day, but he is taking advantage of all of this to basically clean up the United States of all the people that he doesn't really perceive as Americans, because he even doubts that Florida is part of America anymore. He describes it as Central America, and those kind of conflicts, that conversation that they have in between them, the threat, the violence, and the thrill that is in that scene, that's why it excited people so much, because that's something that actually relates to the real world and things that are actually happening. And it's actually incredible because if you take this scene out of the movie, I'm pretty sure you would miss even more. It would feel even more shallow, it would feel even more superficial as a political movie, and that says a lot when it comes to the screenplay itself. Having said that, what do you think about it? Do you think that you needed to be a photographer to understand really what this movie was about? Do you think that this reading improves your opinion on the movie itself? What do you think at the end of the day? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know down in the comments what you thought of it. If you liked this video, don't forget that down at the bottom here I'm gonna be putting other links towards different videos that I've shot on my channel where I talk about the same topics that I've talked about today. I don't know if you noticed, but this week I was supposed to release this video here, but I ended up seeing Civil War and I had some really cool things to add to the conversation. So, well, this is definitely happening in 2 weeks. Don't worry about it. Sorry for the surprise, I guess. Anyways, don't forget to smash that like button. Every single time that you do that, you guarantee there is not gonna be another civil war in the United States or anywhere in the world.
Can I count on you?
Why not? Let's spread peace with these likes, mostly because they don't really seem to have that much of an importance anymore, especially if you look at YouTube algorithms. Having said that, I'm Patrick, and this is Torn Apart.
recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist.
What? No.
Da 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 da